Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we are more than 3 weeks into the Democrats' DHS shutdown. And Democrats keep telling us that they're serious about funding this agency, but their actions speak louder than their words. Negotiations have been going now for well over a month. Democrats have sent 2 offers to the White House. 2 offers that were basically the same. No compromise, no give and take, just take it or leave it. Then on Thursday, perhaps realizing that forcing tens of thousands of DHS employees to go without pay isn't great for their brand, Democrats made a new yet equally unserious proposal, and that is selectively funding certain DHS agencies. That's right, Democrats want to fund the parts of the Department of Homeland Security that they like and keep the rest shut down indefinitely. Now, Mr. President, this might come as news to Democrats, but the fact is that every part of the Department of Homeland Security is essential. As our colleague Senator Britt pointed out on Thursday, Democrats' plan would leave Homeland Security investigations in limbo. A lot of Americans might not know it, but Homeland Security investigations is responsible for some pretty serious law enforcement activities in this country. They look up child predators, drug dealers, terrorists. And then there's Customs and Border Protection, another agency that Democrats' plan would leave in limbo. Now, most Americans interact with CBP officers when they come back to the United States from abroad. They're the people who check your passport. They're also the people who prevent illegal immigrants and contraband like drugs and weapons from crossing our borders and getting into our country. Under President Trump, and thanks to the hard work of these men and women, our border is secure, and illegal crossings have shrunk to a tiny fraction of the record-setting numbers of the Biden administration. The police chief in Sioux Falls recently said this of the drop in fentanyl seizures in South Dakota's largest city, and I quote, "I think it's safe to say that some of the measures taken within the southern border are paying dividends within our community," end quote. Are Democrats looking to undo these gains and return to chaos at the border? Well, on top of all this, Democrats' proposal would also leave enforcement and removal operations unfunded. The people responsible for removing gang members, convicted criminals, and other dangerous illegal immigrants from our country. Mr. President, on Thursday, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Murray, said that Democrats, and I quote, we will not cut a blank check funding without reforms for ICE and Border Patrol, end quote. Well, Mr. President, no one is asking her to. In fact, the DHS funding agreement that Democrats reneged on would have funded de-escalation training for ICE officers, added $20 million for body cameras, and increased oversight of ICE funding. The Trump administration has already taken a number of actions to rein in immigration enforcement on its own, and the administration has made 2 substantial offers to Democrats to legislate reform measures over and above the measures the Republicans had already agreed to. Mr. President, Republicans in the White House are at the table. At the table. It's Democrats who are standing in the way. Mr. President, Democrats can talk all they want about getting reforms, but the only thing they're accomplishing by dragging this out is protecting the status quo. There's only one way to get reform signed into law, and that is by passing a DHS funding bill. If Democrats were really serious about taking action on this issue, they'd be working overtime to arrive at a compromise. But they're not. They don't even want to sit down. Members on our side have reached out to the leaders on the Appropriations Committee on the Democrat side and been told we are not interested in having a conversation about this. Not even interested in sitting down, Mr. President. Would strongly suggest that what they're really interested in is not a solution, but a political issue. They don't really want reforms. They want a political issue that they can use in November. Mr. President, it's 3 weeks and counting on Democrats' second shutdown this fiscal year alone. Tens of thousands of DHS employees are going without pay, and critical DHS priorities are going unfunded. Will this be the week that Democrats actually get serious? I hope the answer is yes. But as of right now, this is what we're getting from the leadership on the Democrat side, the leadership on the Democrat Appropriations Committee, by the way, all of whom negotiated this deal in the first place before they walked away from it. But despite repeated overtures on our side and by the White House to engage with Democrats, they said, we're not even going to talk about it. Not even going to talk about it. So are they going to continue to keep Homeland Security and hardworking Americans in jeopardy? I guess we'll find out soon enough, Mr. President, but I hope that posture changes and they re-engage in keeping important agencies of our government that fulfill important safety and security responsibilities funded, and those employees at work. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Democrat Whip.
Mr. President, last week was historic in the Senate chamber. For the first time, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Services came and appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee. She had been in the position for almost a year and had never agreed to publicly appear and account for her mismanagement of that department until last week. One day before the Senate Judiciary Committee, which I serve as ranking Democrat, and the second day before the House Judiciary Committee for a similar hearing. When the smoke had cleared, President Trump announced via a social media post that he was firing Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. The reason for the decision was obvious after her 2 days of testimony and 2 days of refusal to respond to important questions. Under Kristi Noem's disastrous stewardship, the department was devoid of any moral compass or respect for the rule of law. The city of Chicago was one of the first victims of Secretary Noem's political theater campaign with her so-called Operation Midway Blitz. Instead of targeting the worst of the worst, as the president has frequently announced, Secretary Noem unleashed masked, militarized immigration enforcement officers onto our streets. These officers detained American citizens, green card holders, and community members with no prior criminal records in violent, indiscriminate, and unconstitutional roundups. Do you remember the president's pledge at rally after rally? We're going after the worst of the worst. We're going into the neighborhoods of America. We're going to find the terrorists and the rapists and the murderers and the criminally insane who managed to sneak across our border. We'll find them. We'll send them out of this country or to jail, one or the other. Well, what's the record show so far with that project, that campaign under Secretary Noem and President Trump? They found that only 1 out of 7 of the people who have been detained and deported, 1 out of 7 has any kind of serious criminal record. 1 out of 7. So for their best efforts and for billions of dollars in record-breaking amounts, DHS, with these agencies, has more money than the U.S. Marine Corps, more money than the FBI. How are they doing? If they were batters in Major League Baseball and hit the ball 1 out of 7 times, they'd be not only in the minors, they'd be out of the game. 1 out of 7 people deported have any kind of serious criminal record. Her roving patrols shot a Chicago resident and citizen, Miramar Martinez, 5 times. Miramar Martinez is a miracle, El Milagro. Lucky to be alive. What did she do that was so dangerous? Worst of the worst, that evoked the reaction from the ICE and CBP agents? She was taking a box of extra clothing to her church on a Saturday morning, driving through the streets of Chicago, Kedzie Avenue to be specific, when she was stopped by these agents of DHS. When it was all over, they shot at her car as it departed and struck her with 5 different bullets. Imagine, she's alive today to tell about it. She miraculously survived, but Renee Good and Alex Preddy in Minneapolis were shot by immigration agents there and did not survive. That's why we're in a conversation with the Republicans about changing the procedures of ICE and CBP when it comes to this presidential campaign. To think that innocent American citizens are being shot and killed in our streets is unacceptable, unthinkable, unimaginable, but it's a fact. And that's why we're standing for the premise that these agents have to be held to similar standards that police and troopers are held to all across the United States. How many of your state troopers are wearing a mask today to go out and do their job? In Illinois, none. In your state, probably the same. And how about your local police? Are they wearing masks? Do they have video cameras on? The basics of policing that we accept as professionalism have been rejected by the Department of Homeland Security. We are trying to establish a standard for these enforcement officers that is comparable to the standard of your police and state troopers and deputy sheriffs. That's it. When I talk to law enforcement leaders in Illinois, they shake their heads and say, how many of our law enforcement officers are wearing a mask every day? None. Virtually none. And yet they're insisting that these ICE agents and CBP agents wear masks. They say it's for their own safety. Let me tell you what's for their safety. To have the confidence of the people that you're trying to protect. That's what, when it comes to safety, the standard we should have. Wearing a mask and no identification does not instill confidence in the body politic. Secretary Noem wasted no time in labeling all 3 of the victims I've referred to, Miramar Martinez, Renee Good, and Alex Preddy, as domestic terrorists, misleading the American public and causing immeasurable pain to their families. They were not domestic terrorists or anything like it. And yet she said it in each of the 3 instances. So last week when Secretary Noem finally appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee, my colleagues and I sought to hold her to account. She proceeded, unfortunately, to lie under oath multiple times, including saying DHS followed court orders and had not detained American citizens, despite ample evidence to the contrary. But Noem's abysmal track record wasn't enough to spur the president into action. What was the tipping point? Well, it turned out she had a multi-million-dollar, in fact, over $143 million self-promotional campaign, which showed Kristi Noem riding horses at Mount Rushmore, wearing camo chic outfits, talking about how tough she was. Well, it turned out President Trump got wind of it and said to one of the senators, she spent more money on her self-promotion campaign than I spent to get reelected. Think about that. And as we started asking questions about this TV promotion campaign, it turned out it involved some firms she'd been doing business with in her home state. Too many questions. Donald Trump announced that our colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, will succeed Kristi Noem. We will find out how he plans to lead the department at this perilous moment as the Senate exercises its authority under the Constitution to provide advice and consent on this nomination. And I want to make it clear for the record what happened last week. Senator Patty Murray of the state of Washington, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Appropriations Committee, came to the floor and made a unanimous consent request that we fund every other agency of DHS as we had agreed in a bipartisan manner, and work solely on ICE and CBP to come up with an agreement that establishes some reasonable policing standards. Who objected to funding the rest of this department? The Republican leader. So he had his chance, and I think he'll have it again, I hope soon, to restore the funding for these critical agencies at this moment and give us enough time, we certainly have enough time, to work out an agreement on the procedures when it comes to ICE and CBP. It won't be unreasonable to ask Senator Mullen, if he pursues this appointment by the president, what he will do to change this department in those critical areas. What does he think about shooting innocent Americans in the street? What does he think about his officers wearing masks? What does he think about them carrying video cameras to record exactly what happens at these scenes? What does he think about someone bashing down the front door of your home without a judicial warrant, without the permission or the approval of the judge in the courts? That's just basic to policing across America. These are fundamental questions. Senator, the Republican leader, said earlier, we can do something this week. Yes, we should. We've been waiting for the White House to pitch in a constructive way. Now is the moment to do it. I certainly hope we can achieve it this week, as Senator Thune promised. Mr. President, I also want to report on another subject. President Trump has broken yet another campaign promise to the American people. This is from the New York Times. The headline, Trump, the self-declared peace president, goes to war seeking regime change. The article goes on to say President Trump has become increasingly willing to assert American power overseas, a decade after propelling himself to the highest office by promising to focus on America first. Throughout the 2024 campaign, President Trump promised there would be, quote, no new wars, unquote, if he were elected. But early in the morning of February 28th, Americans woke up to a video from the president announcing that the United States had begun major combat operations in Iran. President Trump took this drastic course of action without consulting with our allies, the United States Congress, or the American people. The Constitution makes it clear, Article 1, Section 8, that only Congress can declare war. This president does not even believe in that. President Trump has tried to position himself as a peace president, but his actions tell a different story. In the last year alone, he has conducted military operations across 3 continents, threatened to militarily take over several countries, including Greenland from our NATO ally Denmark. With Iran, we have seen gas prices spike, American lives lost, and risk and uncertainty in a difficult region. All I worried without a strategy or an end game. In the first 6 days of this war with Iran, the administration and White House announced 6 different reasons and rationales for the war. It's apparent when you look at the reports of the countless Americans stranded in the Middle East that this administration did not prepare a proper evacuation plan. It is obvious in President Trump's rhetoric as well. Just last week when he asked if he should be worried about retaliatory attacks on America, he responded, quote, I guess. This is a chilling, callous statement when faced with the prospect of American casualties. Recent briefings from this administration did little to address the same concerns I had when I was one of 23 senators in October of 2002 to vote against our invasion of Iraq. When I listened to the rationale from the Trump administration for our invasion of Iran, it sounds like the echo of the argument made in Iraq. Remember when we were looking for weapons of mass destruction, which threatened our allies and even the United States? We finally invaded the country, took a quick look around and realized there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, when it comes to Iran, 5 or 6 different rationales have been used to explain why we invaded this country. First, they said stop them from developing nuclear weapons. We're all for that. In fact, the inspectors who were making sure that they didn't develop them were removed from Iran under the first Trump administration by orders of President Trump. Doesn't make any sense to argue we need inspectors when he removed them in the first place, which he never should have done. Second, there's an argument that they're developing ballistic missiles that threaten the United States. Those are months, if not years, away from development. How do you justify this current invasion? Regime change. If the president thinks he can use missiles and aircraft to achieve regime change, I think he's dreadfully wrong. And finally, the notion that Israel was going to attack anyway, so we might as well join in. When you listen to these rationales, they change by the day. Who was designing this scheme, this plan, this strategy? Simply, it's easier to get in a war than it is to get out of one. The president is going to discover that, I'm afraid. I served in this chamber during the Iraq War. I visited the Walter Reed Hospital many times to see soldiers who had just returned from combat. In fact, my colleague, my close friend, Tammy Duckworth, the other senator from Illinois, was one of those casualties. I'll never forget the rows of beds of young men and women with terrible injuries from roadside bombs and IEDs in the Iraqi war. Many of these brave servicemen are still grappling with the wounds of war, whether from traumatic brain injuries or PTSD they sustained in combat. That is the real cost of war, a war which this administration cannot explain the rationale for. When you go to war, the president says some people will die. Sadly, he's telling us the truth, the reality of war. And we should remind the American people regularly that this president promised that would never happen, and yet it has. Americans are not asking for another foreign entanglement. They're asking for a president who puts the American people first in terms of the challenges, the real challenges, the cost of living that they face every day. President Trump has found billions of dollars. We're spending over $1 billion a day in Iran to wage this war. But he cannot spare a penny to help Americans afford their groceries, mortgage, or health insurance. My constituents are already paying more on their gas and energy bills because of the chaos the president has created in the Middle East. That is likely to get worse. There is no love lost between America and the Iranian regime for decades. It has been a menace to the region, its own people. It is a worthwhile objective to prevent them from sponsoring terrorism and building nuclear weapons. But impulsive military attacks carry tremendous risk, uncertainty, and cost that may confront us in the region for months and years to come. That is the reality of war. When I look back, there are 3 of us left in the Senate who voted against the invasion of Iraq. A recent article in the New York Times written by Carl Hulse went and asked senators who voted for the war in Iraq whether they wished they had that vote to take over. Many of them said they had. They wanted it to vote, as 23 of us did, against the invasion of Iraq. As I said, and worth repeating, it is easier to get in a war than it is to get out. And in this circumstance, we don't have a clear mission or a clear commitment from our allies to stand by us. Mr. President, I yield the floor.